Hi, I'm Christian, and today we'll be talking about Reaganomics. So what is Reaganomics? Reaganomics is the economic policy of the 40th President of the United States, which is Ronald Reagan. And these policies called for increased military spending, decreased social spending, widespread tax cuts, and deregulation of the domestic markets. And so Reaganomics was based off of the theory of supply-side economics and trickle-down theory. And so you may be wondering, what are these two theories? Supply-side economics is the economic theory that states that economic growth is stimulated by lowering taxes, decreasing regulation, and allowing free trade in the markets. Trickle-down economics is the belief that taxes on the wealthy should be reduced in order to stimulate business investment in the short term and economic growth in the long term. This theory is very controversial, and many people do not like it because they believe it hurts the poor. So the purpose of trickle-down economics is obviously cutting taxes for the rich, and the whole purpose of this is you're giving more money to the rich, and they let that wealth trickle down to the people who are working for them, who are working for their business, and they're letting this money go to their business, and they're using it on resources and creating jobs and paying for the wages of the people, so that the people now have a good wage and a good amount of money. The only problem is this doesn't always work, because if the super rich gets greedy, then they're going to take out some of this money and keep it all for themselves. Instead of putting it into their business, they're just going to pay lower wages for the people who work for their business. So you may be wondering, why was Reaganomics introduced? Wasn't the economy fine before? Well, it was not. It was introduced to fight a long period of slow economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. And this economic disaster occurred during the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. President Reagan had to combat the worst recession since the Great Depression, so he promised the Reagan Revolution, which would put his economic policy into place, which focused on lowering taxes and decreasing social spending. The first piece of legislation that would be introduced was the Recovery Act of 1891, and other acts were passed by Congress eventually, like the Job Training Partnership Act of 1982, which established job training programs for the people of low income. So you may be curious, what was going on at the time? What was the 80s? So during the Reagan Revolution, technology was also progressing. The Apple Macintosh computer was released, which was a huge step forward for technology. Also, Ronald Reagan signed legislation to make MLK Jr.'s birthday a national holiday, which was a huge step for the civil rights movement and a step closer to equality. Unfortunately, towards the end of the presidency, the stock market crashed, known as Black Monday, and this occurred on the New York Stock Exchange. It recorded a record low drop of 22.6% in one day, and stock markets around the world were also experiencing things like this because of this large crash. The result of Reaganomics. Reaganomics reduced inflation to 4%, which is very impressive, and also lowered interest rates and created millions of jobs. And the unemployment rate also dropped to 6%. So this was great for the economy because more jobs and less people who did not have jobs. And the flaws of Reaganomics was that it hurt the poor and it increased the poverty level. It fluctuated, it got better at some point, but then it just got worse and worse. And then also it put the U.S. in more national debt, and that's still a large problem that we're dealing with. Since poverty rates increased, it didn't just hurt the poor, but it also made more people poor. The reason for the poverty rate to start to fluctuate and start to increase was not because of unemployment, because we know the employment rate started to increase, but because Ronald Reagan decreased social spending, which means he put less money into welfare programs, and this hurt the people who were part of these programs. So Reaganomics ended, Reagan was no longer president, and now George W. Bush was the president, and he faced a large federal budget deficit, so he decided not to raise taxes and to cut spending, which was ultimately not a bad idea, but the stock market did fantastic, gas prices spiked, which was horrible for the economy, and there was a large unemployment rate at the time, so Bush would not win his re-election. Now I'll be comparing the economy from Reaganomics to Vietnam era and the Civil Rights Movement. So the Vietnam era, the South Vietnamese had a centrally planned economy, and it was led by leader Ho Chi Minh, and the economy at the time also heavily relied on U.S. aid. And Reaganomics was the complete opposite, because it's strictly a free market capitalist system with a little government involvement, and this meant less government spending and less taxes. Unlike the two, the civil rights movement did not have one true economy. I mean, the United States had a mixed economy, but there are people who are capitalists and there are people who are communists who are promoting civil rights. Now I'll be discussing the impact of the economies on the people in the three different topics. So for Vietnam, communism had a very negative impact on the people because, as we know, communism is very bad and it led for the people to be poor, people were starving, and it was not good. The economic system of Reaganomics had a positive and negative impact on the people because creating 20 million jobs and decreasing inflation is obviously a good thing, and it helped the working class of America and the majority of Americans at the time. But welfare programs being cut down really hurt the poor, and poverty rates increased for a bit. Now for the civil rights movement, the economy was not as affected because we pretty much had the same economy, a capitalist mixed economy, throughout most of the United States history. But there were changes that were made. We tried to get more jobs for minorities and more spending on education, and this was very good for the economy. The last comparison I'll be making is how these economic systems and movements correlated to the people. Now, the Vietnam era, South Vietnam was fighting for independence and freedom, and they had a really good end goal. They were very pro-human rights, and they were fighting for freedom and independence, but the problem was they had a horrible economic system. So they had good intentions, but they were doing it the wrong way. The civil rights movement, they were pretty much fighting for equality with non-violence. I mean, there are people like Malcolm X who believe that some violence needed to be done, but MLK obviously did not want violence. This was great because they wanted African Americans to be treated equally and fairly, and they fought for the equality for women. Lastly, Reaganomics, I believe it was a very pro-individual rights system, so this is great for the people, obviously, and economic freedom was a big part of Reaganomics, and economic freedom is a large part of freedom. But I believe that there were times where he didn't help the poor enough, and his policy didn't focus on the poor and only hurt the poor, and also a lot of Reagan's policy did not focus around women's rights and civil rights. I hope you enjoyed this educational video about Reaganomics, and now you can decide if you like Reaganomics or not.